After the spread of the cotton gin in the late 1790s, the cotton trade, the international cotton trade, exploded. The U.S. exported 500,000 pounds of cotton in 1800. It was exporting 2 billion pounds by 1860. Cotton represented 60% of what the U.S. was exporting to the world, and it was 40% of what was going out of New York's harbor. So it was a huge deal. The next biggest commodity was, I think, tobacco, and it was less than 10%. So cotton threads tied New York and the South together, I believe, in a long and codependent relationship. The Cotton South, the Plantation South, and New York City grew up together. The explosive growth of the cotton plantations straight across the South, across the Deep South, was largely funded by New York banks, because that's where all the banks were. So, of course, you came to New York for your funding. The New York merchants supplied the planters with everything, from the pianos in their parlors to their plowshares to the clothes they put on their slaves. New York not only shipped a significant portion of cotton, but New York Harbor was where those ships came back to filled with European goods. And that made New York important to Washington, D.C., or Washington City, as people called it back then. It had a big impact on the federal government because the government drew large portions of its revenues from the customs house in New York Harbor. There was a period where the entire federal budget was coming from the customs house in New York City. Now, it wasn't just the bankers and the shipping magnates who profited from cotton in New York City. The thousands and thousands of workers were directly or indirectly profiting from cotton. Dock workers, obviously, but also shops, people in the shops, people who worked in the hotels and the gambling houses and the restaurants and the brothels where lots of Southerners, lots of plantation owners would come up in the summer and treat New York City as their home away from home during the summer months. Everybody was, in various ways, dependent on maintaining the cotton trade, which means they saw it in their best interest to maintain the plantation system and slavery. New York workers also feared that if the 4 million people enslaved in the South were suddenly set free, they'd all come flooding up north and take their jobs away. The big irony there is that the 12,000 free blacks in New York City, the exact opposite was going on. White workers took their jobs from them, froze them out of the unions, so there wasn't really going to be a problem with white guys fighting for their jobs against black workers. So, because of cotton, and because of those ties, and that long and enormous economic tie to the Cotton South, the majority of New Yorkers, not all New Yorkers, but the majority of New Yorkers were pro-South and anti-abolition. They were, in effect, what people called copperheads at the time, Northerners who were sympathetic to the South. It's also worth mentioning that New York was a major northern hub of the transatlantic slave trade. It doesn't have a direct effect on slavery in the country anymore because slaves aren't being brought into the United States by that point. But there was still a huge international transatlantic slave trade. And ships out of New York were picking people up in Africa and taking them to be slaves in Cuba and Brazil and places like that. Congress had declared this piracy, which was a hanging offense, as early as 1820, and then everybody turned a blind eye. It was an open secret that New Yorkers were investing in slave ships, and the profits were enormous. Many slave ships were fitted out in New York Harbor and sailed out of New York Harbor right under the eye of the harbor masters. If they were caught, the slave ship captains, which didn't happen very often, by the way, because the U.S. Navy was like a dozen ships, and the Atlantic is pretty big. But if a slave ship captain got caught, which didn't happen very often, and brought back to New York to trial, it was very rare for him to get convicted. Half the time, more than half the time, they never even made it to the trial. They were just allowed to slip out of the jail. Judges and juries were notoriously lenient with them. If they were convicted and sentenced to anything, they would be sentenced to like 2 months or four months in jail as opposed to being hung. In fact, in the whole long history of New York's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, only one slave ship captain was ever hanged for it, and that was because he had the bad luck to get caught after Lincoln was in the White House and the Civil War had started. So the politics had shifted.